Well, what you're doing is important.
Thanks.
Maybe we can talk about the rhizome a bit, unless you're tired of talking about the rhizome.
No, not at all. No, whatever you want to talk about.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the second session in a conference that we're holding on R.A. Judy's monumental new work, Sentient Flesh, which is a remarkable sort of accomplishment that marks a whole series of important interventions for many years now. Our last session included a discussion of flesh as a concept with professors J. Cameron Carter and Franco Barchesi. And now we're moving on to a conversation between Professor R.A. Judy with Aria Dean. For those of you who were not able to join us, R.A. is a professor of critical and cultural studies in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh and a member of the Boundary 2 editorial collective, where he edited the 2012 collection of writings by the Tunisian activist called the Tunisia Dossier, as well as a special volume on W.E. Du Bois called Sociological Hesitant, in addition to a wide range of absolutely important canonical essays in Black studies, literature, Arabic literature, Islamic thought, critical race studies. He is also the author of a groundbreaking book, Disforming the American Canon, which everyone should read. Additionally, we're going to be joined by Aria Dean, who was a New York, but now an LA-based visual artist and writer, who previously worked as the editor and curator at Rhizo, the leading art organization dedicated to digital-born art and culture, where she helped lead a project on the whole history of net art through online exhibitions, commissions, preservations, and has taken a new job in LA that maybe she'd like to speak to us about briefly. In addition to that, she's also been an artist and will be featured by Red Cat, CalArts' exhibition space in downtown LA, for a show here I think very briefly, like later this month. And then has also done an incredible amount of writing and art writing and critical writing for Artforum, Art in America, eFlux, New Inquiry, and much beyond. Perhaps most notably is an essay that I'm still in love with and teach nearly every chance I get, Poor Meme, Rich Meme, about the circulation and appropriation of Black culture and art within sort of meme studies. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to, oh, I should also thank CalArts, the School of Critical Studies, as well as the Finance Fictions group for helping fund and support this conference. So now, without any further ado, I'll hand it over to R.A. Judy to begin our session.
Good afternoon, all. Let me again start by thanking Andrew for organizing this, and Arne for conceiving it. And of course, I want to thank all of the staff, Steph in particular at CalArts, for handling the logistics and inviting me here to do this project of thinking together with you. And I thank Aria Dean for agreeing to be my to be my interlocutor and respondents. Indeed, baby is a cool machine.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's really an honor to get to, I'm like, very excited. It's really cool to get to be here. And thank you to Andrew also for facilitating getting us in the same space to chat. Go on, you first.
I've been asked to, I'll repeat what I said the first time in case some there in the morning session. I've been asked to read specific passages from Sentient Flesh, a book that was conceived with a very particular sort of investment in rhythm and polyrhythm, and Senghor and Fanon called the attitude rhythmique, the rhythmic attitude. So reading off sections poses a kind of challenge for me conceptually and aesthetically. And I've decided to address that by a sort of paratactic or a reading in montage. And of course, then the whole sense occurs with the entirety of its justifications, and hopefully it will be somewhat clear. I'm going to try to read for no more than 30 minutes, okay? And hopefully I'll keep that without losing any coherence. So I've been asked the second time to talk about parasemiosis. So I'm taking us to the chapter called Para-Semiosis, which I believe begins on page 319 of the manuscript. Para-Semiosis. To begin with, It should be noted that my use of prefix para is in a manner somewhat akin to what Naomi Chandler has termed para-literacy, to name, as he puts it, a universal inhabitation of thought and culture, arising by way of its double position as simultaneously both within and outside of the mainstream. The prefix para, in Chandler's terms, marks a generatively transgressive as a problem of the practice of critical thought, indicating the need of thinking the whole without appealing to some transcendent point of neutral adjudication. It is the problem of thinking from nowhere in a way that overturns existing claims of the relation of the universal and particular, and resuscitates such claims in a larger, perhaps illimitable frame. This epistemological construal is the very pathway of the articulation of a critical self-consciousness of an American intelligentsia, Chandler says. Paraphrasing Spillers on the performative work of the Black creative intellectual. So saying, he then situates Du Bois's 1899 address to the third annual meeting of the American Negro Academy, the present outlook for the dark races of mankind, in a lineage of discourses operating in the domains of treatise, oratory, or sermon simultaneously, from Absalom Jones and Richard Allen to Walker's Appeal and Anna Julia Cooper's. The largesse of this discourse's epistemology stems from the force of its particularity. The African-American problem, Chandler says, is from its inception a displacement from putative primordial origin. The situation specific to African Americans, and there is always such specificity, comes about only by way of social processes that are excessive to any locality, no matter how locality is defined. This very particularity of situation sets in motion or calls for a form super inhabitation of thought, or demands that a certain meta perspective take shape right in the midst of experience, self-consciousness, or the particularities of existence. It solicits the development of a para-ontological discourse. Now, as paraliteracy, the prefix para here denotes this discourse's transgression beyond or beside the ontological, which is itself a way of talking, logia, about being, ontos. But what is this para-ontological discourse about? Some clarification of what this might be is provided by Fred Moten's subsequent elaboration of Chandler's concept of the para-ontological, which he refers to in the course of reflecting on Frank Wilderson's Afro-pessimist pronouncement that blackness, his own and others, is nothing. Grappling with the severity and tension of that pronouncement, Moten is compelled to consider what nothing is, not from its own standpoint or from any standpoint, but from the absolute of its generative dispersion of a general antagonism that blackness holds and protects in as critical celebration and degenerative and pregenerative preservation. That's the mobility of place, the fugitive field of owning. The mobility of place from ask, para-ontologically, by way of, but also against and underneath the ontological terms at our disposal. What is things? What is thingliness? What is blackness? What's the relationship between blackness, thingliness, and the de-regenerative operations of what Deleuze might call a life in common? Moten's four questions add another dimension to the notion of displacement from any putative primordial origin, one in which place is wherever us is moving in space and time, and not a set or to be settled geographical location. This aligns somewhat with my earlier formation regarding Du Bois's insistence on using the term Negro. Negro refers to that which has no proper historical field other than the history of the expression, which is indicial to the world of expression. In denoting displacement, Negro manifestly invokes the totality of placement at work, exhibiting what Chandler refers to as the problem of thinking the whole differently from a meta perspective, a supra-inhabitation of thought that solicits a para-ontological discourse. Assuming that supra-inhabitation of thought is akin to what we are calling poiēsis in Black, we might well ask, how is it ontological? And asking that prompts us to probe even further what para-ontology is about. In light of Chandler's claiming the development of ontological discourse is solicited by that of the paraliteracy, we should take careful measure of his describing the latter as a disposition and possibility, the proposition of a double or redoubled understanding, a remark both sides of a limit, so to speak, of various forms of limited and parochial understandings of the world that have been promulgated as universal, such that the layers of sedimentation in which such distinctions would ostensibly be secured can be rendered susceptible to a certain desedimentation, forgive me. Now, there is a hard to disregard resonance between this sense of paraliteracy, this position Jacques Lacan calls le paraître, meaning the being, para, that is being beside, l'être à côté. Lacan takes care to note that he is saying par être and not its homonym, paraître, used in the philosophy of phenomenal appearance, translating the German Erscheinungen, beyond which there is supposedly no noumenon or thing in itself. Lacanian par être, the being para, is neither phenomenal or noumenal, but rather has to very way the question of being presents itself in the paradoxes springing up with respect to everything that manages to be formulated as the effect of writing. As such, it indicates the contingency and materiality of the letter, uncovering its envers, its other side. The work of both Chandler's paraliteracy and Lacan's par être is expositing a discourse of being that, while not logical in the strict sense of a particular philosophical project, the studying of being qua being, has a lateral relationship to it, which is signed by the para. Taking into account Lorenzo Chase's recognition that Lacan's par être as natural discourse entails the elaboration of a new ontology, or better, a para-ontology, amplifies the relation between it and Chandler's para-ontological discourse. Two crucial insights result from recognizing this reverberating resonance. The first is that even though there is some confluence in the attention given to the dynamics expressing system and subject, the grammar of discourse, between the use of para in the Chandler-Lacanian para-ontology and in what I've designated para-semiosis, there's also a conceptual difference, one which is remarked with Lacan saying we must get used to its substituting the le paraître, the being para, le être para, the being besides, le être côté, from the being that would take flight. The reference being that would being that take is akin to Krakauer's fleeing bourgeois traveler. But this is not to be confused with Negro being in flight, emblazoned by the character John Jones in Du Bois's story of the coming of John. Krakauer's traveler flees from mechanized capitalist classification in order to redeem the inherent integrity of being that has been lost to it. Negro being in flight is being in positionality, and so is neither a flight from capitalist modernity nor toward redemption of a lost self. This conceptual difference is crucial enough. There is a fundamental incompatibility between poetic black as Para-Semiosis, and the para-ontological discourse adduced by Chandler. That incompatibility lies in what is prefixed by para. Gaining this first insight, however, depends on the second, which is that Chandler's claim situation specific to African-American solicits developments of a para-ontological discourse brings into play a particular lineage of mid-20th century Franco-German thought, beginning in 1927, that is tractable by way of Lacan. Cannot sufficiently appreciate what is at stake in the difference between what is to the right of the para, semiosis or ontology, without carefully considering the lineage by a set of questions. The first of these has to do with the putatively universalist discourse whereof being has place. The discourse known as ontology, which para-ontology seeks to challenge with displacement. The challenge involves questions of the transcendence, worldliness, and historicity of being, all three of which turn on the relationship between being, self, and things, prompting an adjusted version of Moten's fourth question. What is the relationship between thingliness, worldliness, and the semiosis of human living in common? With respect to the lineage of para-ontology, that turn hinges on the question, what is the? And in the lineage of thought evoked with Chandler's para-ontological discourse, that question gets expressly identified with the Negro. Historically, the Negro stymies para-ontology, raising the perennial question implied by Thomas Wyndham, what is me in relation to we? Now, this brings to mind, and here's my second, a story about body and soul, told by the ethnologist Maurice Leadhart in his 1947 book, reporting on an exchange he had with a venerable Kanak sculptor, Besso, whom he had become quite familiar with during his time as a missionary in New Caledonia. Leadhart tells of wanting to measure the progress made in Kanak as a result of his long years of instructing them. With this intent, he made a presumptuous suggestion. All said and done, it is the notion of spirit that we Christians have added to your thinking. To which Besso retorted, the spirit? Bah, you did not bring the spirit. We already knew the existence of the spirit. We were already proceeding according to the spirit. But what you did bring us was the body. True ethnological form, Leadhart must explain the significance in the response. The soul Besso refers to is not the Cartesian qua Christian esprit, but the Caledonian ko, to which corresponds the mythical and magical ancestral influx. Leadhart rather blithely disregards the local force of Besso's contradictory retort, bah, as well as the irony of subsequent, but construing the entire response. As well as the irony of his subsequent, but, may, construing the entire response as acknowledging receipt of the firmly delimited personhood precluded by the diffusion of the Kanak socio-mythical domain. In Leadhart's deft exegesis, Besso's response is evidence of what the Kanak had done with the Christian knowledge he imparted, creating a new syncretic understanding of human existence, combining the circumspection of Ko with the epistemology of Cartesianism. So he writes, in a word, defined a new contour, the body. The body had part in the mythical participation. His psychic implosions were the result of supernatural, totemic, or other influences. He had no proper existence, nor a specific name to designate him. He was only a support, but from now on, with the body, the constituency of the physical being ends and makes possible its objectification. The idea of a human body becomes clearer. It is a discovery that immediately leads to discrimination between the body and the mythical world. This story of Leadhart's is recommended here not merely because it is illustrative of para-ontology's alignment with colonialist ethnography, but because of how it precipitates another ethnological reading that contests his understanding of Busseau's response, and corollarily, the para-ontology, opening the way to a more careful understanding of what is meant by poiēsis in black as para-semiosis. In para-semiosis, the visible person must be. Some 26 years after the publication of Docomo, Roger Bastide writes the essay, Le Principe d'Individuation, the principle of individuation, in which he rehearses and critiques Leadhart's exegesis of Busseau's response as being along the lines of a scholastic, specifically Thomist reformulation of Aristotle's notion of matter as the primary principle of individuation. Bastide reads in Busseau's response something other than an affirmation of the Kanak having assumed the Western concept of bodily delimited personhood. Not only is it a contradictory retort to the claims of Christian epistemic largesse, but it is affirming Kanak's semiosis. Indeed, Bastide remarks, the Melanesian does not conceive of himself except as a node of participations. He was outside more than inside himself, in his totem, his lineage, in nature, social. The Christian would teach him to sunder these alterities in order to discover his identity. And that identity is marked by the frontiers of his body, which is isolated from other bodies. Bastide gives this reading as one of two illustrations. The second is the cult of Jama in the Congo, of how the problem of individuation enters into primitive Melanesian and African societies touched by the Christianism of the West. In general, what he terms mutation. Renowned for his anthropological studies of syncretic Afro-Brazilian and Afro-Caribbean religions, Bastide specialized in such mutation. In Le Principe d'Individuation, however, having presented the two illustrations of mutation, he passes over their investigation in order to consider the understandings of the existence of individual person in the most traditional, as in untouched by Christianism of the West, African societies. His declared orientation in this investigation is philosophical, by which he means to consider patterns of thinking abstracted out of certain practices of sign reading, specifically geomancy and divination, and speculations about general practices of initiation and lineage. That agenda is to interrogate the inventory of logical data resulting from a vast investigation of the person in Africa in order to arrive at a general African theory of person. Although Bastide does not pursue the sort of rigorous existential analytic Martin Heidegger undertakes in his own interrogation of ethnological data, there is a certain affinity. Both investigate the ethnological inventory in service of the philosophical project of extrapolating a form of human existence and the attendant way of representing the world, that is to say, in Heideggerian terms, investigating a mode of Dasein. The immediate question of Heidegger's investigation is the historicity of Dasein. For Bastide, it is the principle of individuation, because what emerges from the ethnological inventory is the plurality of the constituent elements of the person. The principle of individuation is posed for most African ethnic groups in the following ways. What constitutes the unity of this plurality? Bastide begins addressing this question by pointing out that many of these constituent elements have existence independent of the human body. They are heterogeneous to the flesh, dynamically engaging it in the constitution of bodily function. He pronounces that the autonomy of these various principles is beyond dispute in African thought. This presents an aporia for Western philosophical tradition, according to which the individual is defined by his intrinsic unity. He is indivisium in se, indivisible. Whereas the person conceived by Africans, Bastide tells us, is divisible. Working from the Western assumption that the unity of the individual necessarily the indivisible human person, Bastide is prompted by the contrasting plurality of the African person to ask, is this the unit aggregate, a node of participations, or a structure? Having posed the question, he points out that the various constituents of the person do not appear or stroke at the moment of birth. They often put themselves in place one after the other. The idea of the person is as a continuous progressive creation analogous to and correspondent with the continual creation of the cosmos. Even so, the fact remains, he says, a certain unity of person emerges. More exactly, it is postulated by the life cycle of the individual. But is this postulated unity a double thought unity? For the African, it cannot be said that the unity is the body, since there are many bodily souls. And even if there was a bodily unity, the body could not impart that unity to the soul, because there are spiritual souls, vital force, shadow, double. It is known that African thought is a thought by mystical correspondence and not like ours, by logical interlocking. We do not encounter with them as we do with the scholastics, who started from the existence of the three souls, a vegetative soul, a sensitive soul, an intellectual soul, the solution of the interlocking. They are one in the other as the triangle is in the tetragon, and the tetragon in the pentagon. We can only discover a solution in correspondence. That is to say, we must seek the key of the individual reality in the set of relationships which bind man to various constitutive principles of cosmos and to all social relations, including, well heard, those he sustains with the dead. The old ethnology, more preoccupied with differentiating ourselves from the primitives and looking for what distinguishes us from them, did not take an interest in discovering the key. It dwelt on the idea of plurality of souls, wanting to see only one unit of aggregation. Contemporary ethnology, from the works of Greux, finds the key to a structural unity in the order of the symbolic. Now, it's not so much the key to a solution, Bastide finds. By his own account, there is no problem among the Africans needing solution. The pluralism of souls does not prevent the unity of the person as an individual. The individual is a formal unit in a dynamic network of successive states of equilibration, imbalance, and re-equilibration between forces that exist beyond while being within it. The person, precisely in the awareness of self, is a composite nodal instantiation of all this articulation. Bastide adduces as supporting evidence two ethnological reports: the descriptive analysis of the Dogon of Kikinu, provided by Marcel Grier's daughter, Geneviève Calmet-Griel, in her Ethnologie et langue, La Parole chez les gens, and the Franciscan priest Palisside Fran Temple's description of the generic Bantu. Now, for the sake of time, to truncate this modality and jump to what's at stake in Bastide's interrogation of those two ethnographic accounts. And what I'm jumping over is the detailed descriptions of those ethnographies. Because what I think is more important for us here is the appositive remark concerning translation about Western languages of these systems in the quote from Bastide I just read to you. The problem requiring solution, then, is a problem chiefly for Western language, or more precisely, for ethnographic discourse and its effort to comprehend the thinking of these so-called primitives. And even Bastide calls it. That problem clearly belongs to what he considers the old ethnology, the ethnology of Bastien, with which Heidegger was conversant. But even the more contemporary ethnology, like that practiced by Calmet-Griot, remained plagued by this problem, something about which she expressed concern, noting that in previous publications devoted to the Dogon ideas of personality, the notion of Kikinu is regarded from a mythical, and so it is translated as soul. Because her work, in contrast, seeks to determine what is the psychological reality concomitant with the Dogon word, she eschews the term soul altogether, except where quoting others' use of it, preferring instead a brief philological explanation that Kikinu is formed by root reduplication, a feature even more apparent in Tombo, where the word takes the form of kindu. Elaborating further that the Dogon associate this word with kinu, nose, breath, life, because the principal move about a wind and enter the individual as he breathes. She adds in a footnote, other plays on words are kene, to organize, because the kikinu organized the person, kine, liver, kini, shadow, which serves as a carrier to kikiriyo. Kalam Negro seeks some relief from the problem of translation in doing this by glossing kikiriyo as pôle d'identification, identification poles, and Bastide followed suit. Nevertheless, her philological grappling makes clear the persistence of the problem for Western languages, and it should be obvious here that we are talking about la langue in the Sartre sense of the abstract systematic rules and conventions of semiotic system, of comprehending and adequately representing a radically heterogeneous semiosis articulating an entirely distinct understanding of human in the world. Should we give credence to Bastide's exposition of the African concept of person, however, taking seriously Griot's descriptive analysis of kikinu, there is no tear. The question is not the who, but the what of being, Heidegger would say, of Dasein. Put differently, the question is not who is human, but what is human being and how. And if this question is not amenable to the fundamental ontology, neither is it amenable to ontic metaphysics, or to what Heidegger would call meta-ontology. We need some other way of thinking that is and dynamic, and we find ourselves back again with Du Bois. Next montage. There are two distinct lines flowing from Du Bois's thought. One which reads double consciousness in the question of the color line as ontological problematics, carries us to parentological discourse. The other extrapolates from the Du Boisian sense of Negro as indicial of a dynamic thinking in action that is at once incomprehensible to the philosophical discourse of ontology and dubious of it. Although it should be noted, given that from its inception, Negro is among the indices of a perennial crisis of ontology, which can be described as the despotic violence of the incursion into existence fundamental to the definition of free man. And Rousseau. Any Negro movement historically cannot but be in relation to ontology, all the more so in ignorance. To state what we know, but persist in refusing to take fully into account, there cannot be man without the barbarian qua slave. And not just in the sense of a conceptual dialectic, but in the sense that it is the instrumentalization of slave energia that creates for the master the material situation in which theoria, deliberative contemplation, and phronesis is possible. Once again, we should pause and take note that while this is true of the decree Negro in distinctive ways, it is distinctive to Negro only insofar as it is distinctively constitutive of the historical, philosophical, ontological project Heidegger set out to redeem in all its discursive modalities. There are comparable indices. For instance, the Indios, Bartolomé de las Casas has reference to in his Memorial de Remedios para los Indios and his Historia de las Indias, in distinction from Negro. While the index Indian, los Indios, connotes for Casas the indigenous inhabitants of the New World Islands and terra firme, who, while barbarous and lacking in knowledge of Christ, possess salvageable human souls, that is to say, in their bodily existence as savages, they are totally expendable and subject to legitimate extinction, but their souls can be saved. The imperial Spanish requirement, requerimiento, 1513, follows the principles of the doctrine of discovery, the basis and justification for which was established by 3 papal bulls, beginning with the Dum de Versas issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1452, authorizing the Portuguese King Alfonso V to conquer the land of the Saracens and the pagans in Africa. Nicholas V reinforced and extended the Portuguese crown's authority to conquer and enslave Saracens, pagans, and infidels to the newly discovered land of the West African coast in his 1455 bull, Romanus Pontificus. That authority was extended to all Catholics, most notably Ferdinand and Isabella, and its territorial space was expanded to include any new lands they might discover by Pope Alexander VI, 1493 bull, inter Caetra, forgive me. Along with the supplemental Dundum Siquedem, which divided the non-Christian world beyond Europe between Portugal and Spain, limiting the Portuguese Ius Patrotus, the New World, in favor of Spain. And following the line of reasoning, the requirement addresses the indigenous population of the Americas, goals to be brought back to Christ, even though they had never had any prior direct knowledge, in accordance with the Augustinian principle that the law is written in the hearts of men, as elaborated by Thomas Aquinas. Therefore, the natural law cannot be erased. And by implication, the indigenous population of the Americas, like the African subjects, possess valid souls that are gained for Christ. The requirement, as well as the papal bulls on which it rests, distinguishes between the human being on the basis of confessional faith, eschewing the Aristotelian categorical distinction of biological capacity for reason. The determining premise is the universal divine character, to become human qua Christian, whether by willful or forced confession, thus legitimating the exercise of violence in the constitution of the beloved community. In contrast, the index Negro, as has already been noted in some detail, connotes the embodiment of capital, animated sentiment instrumentalities of production. Sentient instrumentalities of production. In contradistinction to the requirement of the 1662 Virginia law of partus sequitur ventrum and the Code Noir, with their respective definition of the black body as chattel property, revisits Aristotle's biological grounds for the condition of hereditary slavery. The violence done to the flesh in the black body is not even titularly salvific. There is no salvation. The irrelevance of the black soul is underscored in Article 2 of the Code, stipulating that all blacks are to be baptized and instructed in the Roman Catholic faith. The expressed aim and effect of this violence is nothing more or less than the constitution of the black body, valued only in its pure embodiment as capital energy, an embodiment that is a simulacrum of, or as Kant would say, derived man. Taking full account of this distinction means leaving aside ontology altogether, along with its meta and its para. Looking once more at Du Bois's exchange, Roland Barthes in this regard, Negro refers to fantasy in the order of Roland Barthes, Le mythe petit bourgeoisie de Negro, the small bourgeois myth of the Negro, or the petty bourgeois myth of the Negro, forgive me. In more Lacanian terms, to the knowledge attending the dynamics of imaginary and symbolic orders. Du Bois concedes this, noting the logic of the signifier. Names are only conventional signs for identifying things. Things are the reality that counts. He further notes that this reality is the symbolic, and in its conventionality indicates its own limit. Whether Negro or anthropology, the sign formalizes the impasse between what is symbolized and what is unsymbolizable. Negro denotes the experience of that as the point at which the real subject of experience, in contrast to the subject of science, is encountered in its irreducible incomprehensibility. In Du Boisian terms, the paradox of law and chance. Perhaps the most profound thing about Negro is that throughout its historical usage in our modernity, each and every innovation continually expresses paradox, continually brings to the fore the necessity of formal symbolization, along with that will never be fully symbolized in form. The gist of Du Bois's response to Barton's charge that Negro is a white man's term is, yes, indeed, it is a white man's fable. More exactly, it is a fable about an imaginary type of being that is enunciated in the symbolic order of capitalist modernity. In the conjoining of the symbolic and imaginary, it is an element in the constitution of the world reality that has been imposed on humanity at large. In contrast to the real subject, which resists symbolization, however, Negro, not fully symbolized, is an articulation in free play between symbolic and imaginary, which is to say, because it was never fully symbolized, it is not transgressive, just an altogether other game. Every expression of Negro is an invocation of the inexpressible real, which does not exist just beyond the limit of the symbolic, in the overlapping confluence of symbolic orders. The fundamental impasse Lacan seeks in order to discover the real point of it is resonant with what Du Bois seeks to describe in his analogy of the asymptotes of the hyperbola. Du Bois's hyperbolic asymptotic thinking, however, does not transvalue truth and knowledge as effects of semiosis set against the inestimable real access through really subjective play of transgression. Asymptotic truth and knowledge are certainly effects of semiotic dynamics. They are relations of semiosis in common, saying something, if you will. But this saying in common, while clearly the articulations of assemblage and relation of multiplicities, existence of which is given in the dynamics of semiosis, is not forgotten behind the said. There is nothing said that goes without saying. Fourth and final montage. Staying attuned to resonances, the buzzard lope dance, which is a dance that I discussed at some length earlier on in the book, with its conceivable syncretism of Christian semiosis and those of what William Allen Melville Herskowitz and Lydia Parrish labeled Africanisms, enacts the same process of divisibility Bastide discerned in the nodal eventfulness of supposedly African semiosis. Indeed, this may well be where Negro and African share the same connotation, the dynamically fluid relationality of human beings. Explaining this is requisite to explaining the relationship between para-semiosis, poiēsis, and blackness. That is to say, elaborating further what I mean to connote these three designations. Chinua Achebe once remarked that Africa is not only a geographical expression, it is also a metaphysical landscape, in fact, a view of the world, of the whole cosmos perceived from a particular situation. Valentin Mudimbe presented just 15 years ago some remark that, while not expressly directed at Achebe's, complicates them in a way immediately pertinent to the distinction I'm drawing here between para-ontology and semiosis. Mudimbe's remarks touch directly on the question, what is African thinking and how do we encounter it, which haunts our engagement with Bastide, visible person, but also in its total disregard of the Negro in relation to the African. It prompts the question of blackness as bound up with the distinction between para-ontology and parasemiosis. And let us be clear about this now. That distinction has to do with whether thinking in action is critical and autocritical semiosis is philosophical. The claim being made throughout this work is that it is altogether doing something else. In the course of reflecting on the motivation behind changing the title of the Bulletin of the Society of African Philosophy in North America to the Bulletin of the Society for African, the Bulletin of the Society of African Philosophy in North America to the Bulletin of the Society for African Philosophy in North America, Mudimbe expresses a general suspicion concerning the concept of African philosophy, the question of a supposed confusion of philosophy as Weltanschauung, and on the other hand, philosophy defined as a critical, autocritical, explicit reflection bearing on language and human experience. Such agitation was signified in the privilege that the society chose to give the preposition for as a way of naming its own task. In effect, the implication of the genitive with its slippery issue of origin in the expression, Society of African Philosophy, in which the adjective African might seem to represent an intrinsic and essential difference, in some the singularity of a nature, we choose the detour expressed by the preposition for, as indicative of a project. Its objective, the practice of philosophy by students of African descent or by individuals conceiving their identity, in any case their perceptual or their real behavior, as more in African geography, be it mythical, in any case, simply representational. Such an epistemological providence, or prudence rather, was to allow us, among other things, an elegant and critical handling of two metaphors. On the one hand, Heidegger's affirmation that philosophy is Greek. On the other, the pertinent common sense saying, no one speaks from nowhere. And in practical terms, this meant a postulate that any parole, any speaking, is always, in its difference, qualified by a locus, a time, the consciousness and indeed the unconsciousness of the speaker. In such an orientation, are expressing a right and a duty, and also simultaneously the fact of a bindung and an entbindung, bond and unbinding, linking the African speaking subject to a self and to a locality, at the same time positing the subject as inextricably mingling with an alterity, with someone else, and an alter, thus very precisely as unstable, insofar as such a subject cannot negate its own expansion, its existence outside itself, in the alter in whom it can bind to itself. It followed that it was always reasonable for us African students of philosophy to be attentive to Heidegger's challenge, his pronouncement on philosophy as being essentially Greek. How could one avoid the Greek initiative and the already long history of philosophical practice while acknowledging the obvious around us, testimonies of intellectual investments, witnessing its African experience? The lengthy passage is here so as to fully display the flow of Mudimbe's thinking, which turns on three salient points. First, the aspirational preposition for, already conceived the hegemonic force of philosophy as a privileged modality of critical, autocritical reflection on language and human experience. Declaring the project is to do philosophy, it is worth doing in its own right. And that is to accept the fundamental terms of the ontological project from its earliest moment of origin. We have broken into existence in order to understand existence best of all, and so define who is human. It follows from this that to take up the project as African not only adheres to the anthropological taxonomy, a taxonomy that Mudimbe works hard to deconstruct elsewhere, but conceives the project of acculturation, the expanding imposition of the master discourse. Indeed, Mudimbe's essay is a moving personal account of missiology, an acolyte induction into the philosophy of anthropos, say a scholastic education, a socio-cultural context, and indeed the spiritual and ethical insecurities of identification, mimesis, with and resemblance, homeosis to models. In sum, an intellectual, its detours, and the vertigo of its internal logic. Heidegger's challenge is accepted on Heidegger's terms, and the issue of the African is not quite adequately addressed. Obvious, yet unavoidable questions pose themselves here. What does it mean to be marked by an African geography? Does it mean to be marked in the discourse, or is it the discourse of racialized capitalist modernity? Cartography constitutes the world in precisely Heidegger's sense of a totality of referentiality. It is a matter of relevance for whom? For philosophy, of course, the necessity of the original Greek incursion, that is Heidegger's challenge. There is a crucial in Mudimbe's reflection, where in reference to the African orientation to philosophy, he expresses a right and duty to link the African-speaking subject to a self and locality, while at the same time positing itself as inextricably mingled with others. The positing aims to engage a subject that is unstable insofar as it cannot negate its own expansion, its existence outside itself in the alter in whom it can bind to itself. With an eye toward Bastide's depiction of the African person, we can rephrase this as a subject that is divisible insofar as it instantiates the pluralities existing outside that bind the subject to them, and so to itself, in constant and continual signification. If we can listen to Bastide with incredulity, however, that divisible subject is an ancient testimony of intellectual investment, which he finds at work in scattered places across the globe, such as Brazil. Herskovitz, Hurston, and Lomax also see signs of it throughout the Caribbean and southern coasts of the United States, which is to say everywhere they cared to look. The quandary Mudime shares with us is not about bringing philosophy to Africa. Heidegger's challenge is a shibboleth of little consequence. The quandary is even how to Africanize philosophy. Rather, it is once African testimonies of intellectual investments witnessing its African experience encounters philosophy, philosophy stalls and loses its verve. Recall, Heidegger himself announced this in his inability to think the Zul Kefere, the Zulu, and the Senegale Negre, the Zulus and the Senegalese. And his inability to think what? To think with semiosis. For him, Negro denotes that incomprehension. There is indisputably existence there, and it is equally indisputably existence precisely in his Heidegger sense of world constituting signification. It's just that ontology, that is to say, philosophy, can't speak to it or even of it in any comprehensible way. It can only look on dumbfounded. So much for the universal necessity of the incursion. This brings us to the third point. To say that any parole is always in its difference qualified by a locus, a time, which determines the consciousness of the speaker, is merely to point out that speaking is a performative action of positionality in some order of referentiality within a totality of signification. I say something to you with the proposition that what I say is of relevance to us both. That relevance constitutes what we have in common. Along these lines, Mudimbe's ambition is to make Africa a position from which speaking is received as relevant to the already long history of philosophical practice initiated by the Greeks, as the story goes. Leaving aside for the moment the problematical limitations of Mudimbe's expressly focusing the project only on Franco-Germanic philosophy, Africa is not merely a philosophical invention. It may have started out that way, as that space, both phenomenal and conceptual, outside epistemic grasp, except as the extreme beyond, where thinking is severely curtailed. But with its embodiment in actuality, that is to say, with the invention of Negro as sub or quasi-human property, there emerges a plethora of potentialities of possible being, of actual ways of being, for which Africa designates an orientation in flight, as in the parable of flying Africans told by folks across the Georgia Sea Islands. This African orientation is asymptotic, the positing of a point from which one knows to have arrived only at arrival in slavery. The new African must be broken in a process of euphemistically called seasoning, and then as an orientation in flight from enslavement. Africa is a symbol of being nowhere, yet constantly on the move there, in an order of signification. Negro discourse that has no relevance in the Heideggerian sense of vivantis to philosophy, except as dismissible mythical tales, folklore. Let me suggest, however, that this discourse is a far more generative alter to whom the so-called African might speak in pursuit of critical and autocritical reflection on language and human experience. In it, Africa signs that which has no proper historical field, other than the historicity of the expression constituting the world of referentiality. In this sense, Africa is an indicial sign of the perpetual activity of translation and transvaluation, constituting the world and the witness of modernity. To paraphrase Achebe, Africa is not a geographical expression, it is a generative symbol in a careful semiosis of the world of the whole cosmos, perceived from a particular situation of nowhere. Displacing metaphysical landscape with careful semioses presses on the philosophical implications of Achebe saying, the nowhere. Qualifying the particular takes us back to the specificity of situation Chandler speaks of, with which we began our interrogation of the para-ontological, working our way through it in an unsettling movement so as to leave it behind us, never to return, except as occasional tourists. That situation and movement is the knower from which we ask with Moten, now no longer para-ontologically, what is blackness as an aspect of a life in common? I'm not going to read the fourth montage. I think that's enough for us to begin, and I've gone on long enough. Thank you.
Hi, I'm back. That was amazing. It was great to get to like, yeah, read along with you as you went over that. I think it's helpful also to hear it, and yeah, going in that sort of reconfigured order is really interesting as well. So I guess first of all, are there things that you would like to say before we get into conversation, or do you want to speak at all to what the final piece you were going to read would have been, or I don't know, just any comments before we get into it?
I wanted to leave time for you to speak so I can engage your thinking.
Okay. Well, I guess to me, the thing that I'm most interested in talking about, amongst like a million things, I guess is thinking about, and this is something that, you know, when I hopped on the Zoom while you guys were sort of, after you finished the first session, you guys were chatting about, it sounded a bit like there was some conversation around this, but kind of trying to figure out, I guess, with this idea of parasemiosis, how, I guess, like we see this, I mean, you get into it in the text, but where we see this existing in the world, particularly, I guess, when you talk about the visual at times and representation, but I guess the thing that struck me so much, I guess, in terms of like the work that I've done and thinking again, often in terms of the visual as an artist, like how do you achieve, or where do we see that mode of like signing achieved in the visual realm, and like how do we sort of talk about that, and how do we arc towards that on a practical level? Because I think even in terms of like this question of the body and the soul and the spirit, I started thinking about like photography and film, and how I think so much of what's difficult about finding a way to talk about the appearance of Black people in film and photography that circumvents the sort of shut down, like liberal humanist representational schematic of thinking. You know, the part of the problem is just that we do see individual bodies that are moving in space in a way that's recognizable to us, that tracks with that logic. So I guess, yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on, and I know also like both like literature and music are often referenced, and I think those modes seem like easier in a way to like to speak about in the sort of parasemiotic way. But anyway, yeah, do you have thoughts on the visual, I suppose?
Yeah. But parasemiosis, I mean, a kind of non-synthetic confluence of multiple modes of representation, of signification. And, you know, I think it's manifested in all kinds of very specific ways in our world. In terms of visual representations, as you mentioned, I've been really engrossed in the work of Sondra Perry.
Yeah.
Whose multimedia installations, I think, are a wonderful manifestation, both in terms of the multiplicity of the media and the way she uses them without achieving a synthesis, right? But also then in composition, right, where there's this movement of arrested fluidity. And I've had the chance to see them in installations in Miami where there's a movement, so it's not even arrested, unlike the stills, right? And that movement of these multiple flows going back and forth has a narrative force, right? It tells a story, right? And it's a narrative force that brings us in affectively.
Yeah.
Which doesn't even get disrupted by that necessary curatorial intervention of the plaque.
Yeah.
Or which of course she plays with, I would say again, wonderfully in her kilter namings of her own pieces, right? And so here I'm wanting to draw a very close relationship, if not analogy, between what I call semiosis and the old rhetorical figure of parataxis, kind of like the play I did with montage, which is very much a part of the visual, the together of really autonomous, discrete, heterogeneous scenes, right? That are brought together, not necessarily in clear sequence, but in an arrangement where the meaning, the significance is only accessible in the totality of the arrangement. And here I'm thinking about film. And one film that I wrote about rather recently is this wonderful film which I highly recommend, by the Beninian filmmaker Idrisu Marokapai, called America Street, which he filmed in 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina, on the street called America Street, which is a very particular street, a certain reputation in Carolina, in Carolina, a street of danger and drugs and all kinds of other things, but also a street that's being gentrified. And what Idrisu does in that film that I think is it's clearly paratactic, right? Firstly, he's a documentary filmmaker. The speaking patterns of doing documentaries to focus on a particular individual, and that individual functions as a protagonist. So we're dealing with what the individual is saying and how he is speaking and how she is interacting with the world. And so in this case, the protagonist is a man named Joe Watson in his corner store, Mama's Sugar Shop, or Sweet Shop, forgive me. And the way in which Joe Watson talks, being from Charleston and being associated with the Gullah Geechee culture, and the way in which those people he interacts with talk is very paratactic. It's this disjuncted parables and fables, right? And there's a certain rhythm speaking as well. And what Idrisu does with his film in his cinematography is he has the scenes of the film structured in montage, where there's an amazing syncopation between the rhythm of the cinematographic movement, the montage rhythm, and the speaking pattern, right? And so what gets articulated is indeed a wonderful representation of the rhythm of Charleston, in which the film itself, in its composition, is taken up into. That's parasemiosis. And of course, one of the things that compelled Idris to do this is he wanted to understand this new city he had just been dropped into as an African. You know, not knowing the history of slavery, not knowing the history of Charleston, right? At a moment just before Walter Scott was shot, and then of course at a moment before the Mother Emanuel massacre took place, because he began filming before then.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And so he's trying to think with these people to understand them by seeing if there aren't resonant rhythms, which makes his filmmaking about Black America as an African different than Gremas, for example, another very famous African filmmaker who much of his career has focused on representations of Black American struggles and existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Black Mama being an iconic example of it, and of course Sankofa another. Yet Gremas's works, there's this sort of distance there, right, between the camera and what's being depicted, which gives a certain sort of almost romantic lyricality to it. Whereas, and I'm not saying that Gremas isn't parasemiotic, I'm just marking a difference. Whereas Idrisu Kapaye in his film is actually trying to produce a new aesthetic form adequate to that moment of living.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I want to say, is part of the political aspect, if you will, or purchase of Para-Semiosis. So those are some of the examples of the concrete manifestations of Para-Semiosis.
Well, it's interesting because I think that like what sounds like to me you're saying a lot of it has to do with like there's this entanglement of the formal, like it's with these films, like the formal approach to the story rather than simply like, yes, like I'm representing Black life in XYZ way, but really kind of a great attention paid to not simply the way it's represented, like, you know, ethically speaking or kind of like narratively, but really like the way that the understanding of how film operates is. And it's interesting also when you talk about montage, like, and also even in the in your presentation, the way that, you know, yeah, it's a montage, but you've reoriented the sort of, you know, the linearity of the montage as we receive it on the page, and you've presented it in, as far as I understood from my copy of it, in a different order. It is also a view of montage that does kind of move differently than a traditional, like, you know, certain writing about film in the 20th century where, like, you know, the montage is rather statically configured in terms of like, you know, it must follow this way. It's more of like a Deleuzian kind of, at least in my sort of reading of it. And like I've been reading a lot of like Deleuze on cinema recently and really enjoying his approach to that and kind of finding it resonant with like the things I've been trying to think through in terms of Black studies and visuality. So that's kind of exciting to think about that way. And yeah, then I think also like this sort of, yeah, I guess there's not really a question there, but just, yeah, it made me think about Deleuze. And like, I mean, obviously you're thinking about Deleuze in, you know, the book at large, which I think is really interesting. And then, and also I guess maybe this is more of a question or sort of line of thinking. I don't know if you enjoy or have thought about like Pasolini's writing on film, and sort of the way he talks about like that. There's that one piece, Observations on the Long Shot, where he talks about like, and he, you know, his sort of quips about how you know, film might not be necessarily representative of life, but rather like, you know, filming and editing is taking sort of like a slice out of the sequence shot that is life. And I think that that's sort of an interesting in terms of like an ontology or like metaphysics of cinema, I think is an interesting like offering. I don't know, that's kind of tangential, I suppose. But yeah, so I mean, I don't know, I think that like, and the other thing I also then wanted to ask about was, I liked the way you're saying about the, I don't remember what page it's on now, but the sort of black body as simulacrum as well. And sort of wondered if you could talk about that sort of the idea of the body potentially being brought by Christianity a little bit more, and sort of like, I don't know, I just wanted to go back to that. I thought that was really...
Well, first to pick up the first part that you were talking about. Yeah, that Deleuze is there clearly, but I think that, and especially in my reading of Idriss's film, but that Idriss was doing something quite different from even Deleuzian's take on the slice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he still maintains this distance. There is the position of the observer, and the camera is this particular kind of eye. But what people like, and it's not just Maroko Pai who does, Abdurrahman Sissisco in his wonderful film Timbuktu and other films. Hassan Habari does this in his movies, where the camera is an interlocutor in the discourse, right? And this is quite wonderfully done with the Americas. And in fact, closer to home, love is the message, right? AJ in his film work, even the way in which he messes with the rules regarding number of frames per minute, the conceptualization of time, right? Does more than just up the classical understanding of montage, at least understood in film studies. But again, the camera becomes an interlocutor discourse. In fact, I happen to know, I know AJ. There was a film he did of Hortense. I was around in the background, Hortense and Richard Blint, in which her, but it wasn't tricked. It's a matter of his form, in which he ostensibly said they were going to do a run before filming of the conversation they were going to have, and she was very relaxed. They had this really robust conversation, and when she said, "Okay, we're going to film," he said, "We already did." Right, and that was performative. That was making the camera an interlocutor.
Right.
So what's my point in terms of what you're saying? That and this is an aspect I want to argue about Para-Semiosis, which is why your question, I think, I really welcome this. The distinction form and content doesn't hold.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I talked about the issues of composition, for example, with respect to Perry's work and otherwise, that there's always dynamic, and you cannot. One of the things that bothers me about much of the discussion about film, although that's beginning to change in some ways, and even about art.
Mm-hmm.
There's this interesting journal, Liquid Black, that's come out recently, and there's the work that you're associated with, the journal Raison. So it's moving away from what I'm about to critique. Has been a long tendency to talk about thematic issues, and to parse formal questions out of thematic issues. Right? Now, one of the things with filmmakers like Pai that I'm referring to, or Gremas, or Charles Burnett, or Judy, or AJ, and it's significant. These are all people, except for Idrissu, who are associated with the LA Rebellion, right? With the Black film movement. Is the very nature of how they go about their mimetic performance practice, filmmaking, in a word, really problematizes and makes almost impossible the parsing out of theme from form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's there in their cinematography. That's there in even in the post-production of editing. Right? I'm thinking of Daughters of Dust as a wonderful example, right? Or Sleeping with Anger. The list is long, right? So yes, form is important. And what I did with my own performance here was about form, right? Form is important. This is my investment in the whole idea of semiosis, and why such terms as articulation I keep putting forward, but it's processual, right? So that what we want to identify as thematic issues, right, are functions, are articulations of formal movement. Deleuze, in part, wants to recognize this. He's trying to undo the usual way of understanding montage, but because he maintains a particular position of masterful analysis and critique, and doesn't sufficiently displace, but reiterates. As to your second question, that's, yeah, what more can I say about this? I think I just did a lot.
Now that you've gone more down the road, I think going back and forth about a bit about this like form and content thing, I think is actually quite interesting, and that's been on my mind a lot. I think in my own practice, and then also in trying to write about art in contemporary the contemporary context, and sort of the way in which like I feel like I've been trying to work through, like, came to art with an understanding that, because obviously art, historically speaking, there is writing for so long that mitigates against this sort of like form versus content binary. But then kind of there's what felt like a resurgence of that, but then also in terms of like an understanding of an artwork's effects or something, a sort of real confusion over again, a separation of like the symbolic versus the material like layer of what an artwork is doing. And I spoke to Frank Wilderson about this like a few months ago, and it was really enlightening. So I was like, I feel crazy for being so upset about this like thing where it seems like everyone's like splitting like form and content so much in the symbolic and the material. And he's like, no, you're right. Like, it's like there is this, entanglement that's not really being adequately dealt with in terms of how people think about their practices possibly, or how people write about what artworks are doing when they're exhibited in different places. So I think it's really encouraging to hear what you're saying about that. And I think with those filmmakers and with like someone like Sandra's work, I think also I think some of Martine Sim's work also exists in this space where it's really trying to, or not even trying to, but just kind of coming from a very strong position of constantly holding form and content together in that way. So I think it's exciting. And I think
or Glenn Ligon's work, for example.
Yeah.
It's not inconsequential that the cover art of this is a David Hammond.
Yeah. I was gonna. I'd like to hear more about. I guess. I mean, it's interesting. And are you? I mean, you're a big. Yeah, you're a Hammonds fan, I suppose. Then in that.
Who could not be?
No,
but who cannot? We're talking about important. Breaking work. But in terms of what you're talking about in the conversation you're reporting with Frank, for me, what's at stake here is to draw attention to expose the political and hence epistemological investments in that distinction of form and content, and understanding the relationship between form and content. Which is still primarily Aristotle, and the investments there, political, epistemological, have to do, and this is the whole point of my critique of ontology, have to do with the investment showing up a very particular understanding of what is human. And a particular understanding of what is human that has quite destructive aspects to it, but which we adhere to often unwittingly. And I think that's part of what you're discussing in terms of recent noise around the appreciation of Black art, around the constitution of something practice called Black art, right?
Right.
And the way so much of the conversation doesn't sufficiently engage the questions of formal expression.
Right, which then I think is kind of like
not everybody around.
Go on.
No.
I was going to say, I think, and then that even also goes into that sort of like the simulacrum thing I was asking about. So I think there's also this sort of like in terms of the formal qualities of that expression, like I think there's also, I've felt this frustration with like, I guess if, you know, and as you're saying in your work, and as is expressed in the works of people like Wilderson and you know, even like Winter and others in various ways, like if like the Black is like the sort of boundary point between, yeah, like human, like inhuman or quasi-human, or is this quasi-human position, like what do you actually do with that on a formal level? Like, you know, let's say in sculpture, I think that's like, I've been preoccupied with that, you know, in the last few months, like as I've been working on just particular shows, like not that I'm like trying to sculpt Black people, I'm not making like, you know, figurative like, you know, representational sculpture work, but like how can I like make work that sort of sits in that boundary point in a way that is like, for lack of a better word, true to, or like, you know, honest to, or tracks with this sort of like actual, yeah, the actual this actual sort of position in terms of the relationship to the world. And I think that it's difficult because there's not, like, I think this book is so exciting because it's really giving, at least for me, feels like a language to like a toolkit for like really speaking that space. And I think that other work has done that, but it seems like kind of this like, and also the way that you're historicizing it is really helpful. But yeah, it's like that, but that the way that it's, yeah, the simulacrum thing I think is interesting for kind
there's the remark about simulacrum was meant as a critique of the ways in which the term Negro as a concept
yeah.
reveals completely the long of the structure of capitalist modernity.
Right.
So that whenever we're talking about the Negro, we're talking about the entirety of that history. And in fact, you can't talk about the Negro without studying the entirety of that history.
Right.
And how that relates to the concept of Blackness as well becomes a complicated move in the text, because part of what happens with the constitution of the Negro is sort of indented in the hold of slave ship in a very particular way. It's an articulation of a certain turn in the structuring of society towards the market, towards capital in a certain way. But what it's produced out of and on is a certain flesh, and that flesh is already interpolated, overlapping with some other system of semiosis, right, which we can call loosely African. And the Constitution of the Negro never exhausts that semiosis. It's still at work, right? And so it's at work in the things that those people called Negro do that have nothing to do with the market. They don't do it necessarily in response to white people. Historically, of course, because they've been constituted in that relationship, but they're not going to create this, you know, with the white man in mind. It's how they're expressing their living and how they're expressing their notion of being in the world and being in the world in common. And here, to be historical, I'm going to say this very much is resonant with what Leopold Senghor wrote about a long time ago, when he was arguing about African artists. I don't adhere to his ethnobiologism at all, but he makes an important point about different modalities of thinking, right? And the ways in which visual forms in the Senegambia region, right? Those visual were modalities of thinking, and they were modalities of thinking that were manifestations of cosmologies and of understandings of what reality, what is the world, what and how are we, who are we, what's our relationship to one another. And the attention to questions of form that people like Glenn Ligion engages in, or going back to one of the great grandfathers, David Hammons, is thinking. Right? What you're describing in your working with sculpture, this is about thinking.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah, that's
and,
sort of,
thinking is always. Pardon?
Yeah. No, go on.
Thinking is always historical. Thinking is always in relationship to others. Thinking is always, as I say in the book, semiotics. The part of the issue is and here it's not just about Black art. It's the ways in which our concept of art for some centuries is bound up with complicated, perhaps troubling notions of value. Right?
Yes.
So that the thinking is not important. What becomes important is the market value of the artist is assigned. To go back to simulacrum, there's in a piece I recently published in Liquid Blackness, where I talk about liquidity, is a sort of eerie echo of the economic liquidity of owning slaves. In the 19th century, a boom global economy of credit emerged, premised on the value of the fact that you owned a slave, not premised on the value of the labor the slave produced, or even the commodity, right? But the fact that you own such potential itself could be the basis for borrowing more money,
right,
to enhance this capacity. And so what becomes then is really a simulacra. What becomes value then is this sort of empty signifier. And we see that in the emergence of all of these investment banks, who are valuing art. And they draw portfolios, right? Deloitte Art and Finance Group, there's a whole number of them, which, and I'm sure you know about it, where the whole point is we can turn artwork, which is not fungible, into fungible.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And the turn here is, so the artist is valuable because of the social positionality of Blackness, not because of the art produced. Right, but because of this association between Blackness and the art. And so you buy it and you put it in storage and you can use it for collateral, etc. And that goes across the table. It could be the artwork of, let's say, Shazia Secunda, right? An amazing Pakistani American artist who for a long time worked with Lowe's Houston Row House project. Right? Is there this tension between thinking and different forms of thinking and structures of marketable value, and the way there is a kind of parallel or echo between that and what happened around the financing of slavery and the financial value of slavery is important, because what then is an underlying assumption about who can own, which is about then who is human, who's not human, an underlying assumption about the nature of expression and the relationship between thinking and being in the world.
Yeah.
I don't know if that at all adequately addresses what you were saying.
I mean, yeah, I don't remember what I asked, but it was really interesting. I mean, that's something I've been thinking about. That's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I think there was this thing maybe in the summer or probably around the time of the protests and the George Floyd stuff, but there was Christie's had a big auction where they brought in a bunch of new Black artworks and whatever. And people were like, oh my God, this is so exciting. And I was like, this is not this is, kind of watching the mechanics of this really long historical process kind of re-materialize in this way, and it's really and it was just this acceleration of a speculative market around Black art production in this way that and then also around the same time there was that announcement about Zwirner having the new space. I don't know if you saw this, but this new space that's going to be dedicated to exhibiting Black and POC artists and headed by this Black woman, and but the artist, it's a Kunsthal style gallery space, so there's no promise of them being brought in as artists represented by the gallery or institutional whatever. It's kind of just exposure oriented, which is also just we're across the board really enthused by this, and it's cool for everyone who gets involved in terms of personal gratification. In terms of the larger, what it signals in a larger economic, cultural, and whatever sense, it was, I thought, quite disturbing, because not only is it again reenacting these dynamics, but then also the discourse is not equipped to see that in any larger sense. So that's a bit disturbing. I'm also curious what you think about. I think a lot of people, and maybe half jokingly over the years, and even including myself, have kind of asked this question about if art with a capital A has this sort of humanist history, human being, proper subjects creating these objects for an audience to witness and experience. I guess in light of that, and then if we think about Black people being positioned or as these quasi-human subjects or as non-human entities, or as commodity, humans turn commodities, etc. Does that fundamentally shift how we can talk about art production art produced by Black people, in terms of the relationship between subjects and objects in that kind of arrangement? Does that make any sense? Is that does the category of art make sense in that? And this is I don't know, a silly kind of speculative question.
Yeah. one of the interesting things about what you're talking about, again, to be historical, is one of the premises of the New Negro movement. At least the premises articulated by one of its principal spokesmen, Alain Locke, was that by Black people, Negroes, producing high art, right? Some version of modernist expression, they would counter and counter persuasively white racism, and it would counter the position that Blacks were not fully human, right? Where one of the measures of humanness is the ability to create art. So, okay, so if Blacks can create high art, persuade white people that in fact they're fully human. Right? Now, of course, that's a problematic project coming and going. One can appreciate its historical moment, right? But where it's problematic coming and going, both on the part of those who want to argue that art is the measure of humanness, and that Black people then will lead to their inclusion in humanness, is precisely what you're alluding to, and that is that it doesn't attend adequately to the problematic nature of the very idea of itself. You know, what are we talking about when we say this, right? And yeah, we know this has been written about extensively. Gumbrach has written about it, T.J. Clark has written wonderfully about it, and repeatedly trying to problematize it. This goes to what I consider some of the drawbacks in art history is, in some sense, amazingly retrograde.
Yes. Yeah.
And aspects of that are manifest in the turn towards the celebration of curatorship and galleryship and ownership as being the driving engine of culture, that is to say, of art culture. And so the Christie's event is a very important event. I've got a student of mine named Charles Ethnomusicology, who's got a very interesting project in which he's critiquing the sort of iconography that was going on at Christie's. And it was going on in a broader context, right? Because that in large measure that we're talking about. You know, the young woman who was killed in Kentucky, whose name escapes me. I know I am blocking it out because right now I'm thinking in iconoclastic ways. She was shot to death in her bed by the police.
Are you talking about Breonna Taylor?
Breonna Taylor.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about her, and just like, you know, I'm from Minneapolis, what's happened to George Floyd immediately upon his death, where all kinds of artists from outside the community descended upon the community and took over the space, has been the process of iconographication. That is to say, the image, Breonna Taylor in particular, images that have circulated around the world don't look like her. And in important ways, right? As she becomes a universal symbol of change. Her features get changed. Her skin tone gets changed. Her hair gets changed, right? There's some sort of grammar there, some sort of iconography at work there. And that grammar and iconography, I'm saying, is part of what I critique as the project of a certain kind of philosophical ontology. It's working on the assumption that a particular way of looking is associated with being human. And if we're going to talk about human, universal human value, we have to approximate that look, right? So all of our of reference must be within that look. So, I mean, that is addressing your question of what does it mean to talk about art and what art's doing. Yes.
Yeah.
You know, what do we say art? But more to the point that when we introduce the issue of Black study in this context again, we get down to fundamentals. What are we thinking about being in the world?
Yeah. What's interesting with the Breonna Taylor thing as well, something that I've been very interested in, and I think with what you're saying also. It's always interesting in terms of the like supposed ethics of the moment as well, where sort of like, I know there was like that there was a picture of her where, you know, she's like she's standing in some room, and kind of like the picture that most representations of her have been based on. There's a sort of like ethical thing, or I think ethical will be the word I would use to describe it, like this sort of don't circulate an actual image of the person kind of call, where people are like, you know, like to like as though, and I don't know how I feel about this, but sort of like circulating an actual likeness of her is somehow violent because reproducing her image over and over. But then people chose to instead reproduce or, you know, represent her and kind of, yeah, increasingly kind of like not degrade her likeness necessarily, but as you're saying, like shift it in kind of iconographic size it versus like just the simple reproduction of her image. I think that's an interesting thing. And then that also, of course, is some sort of extension, it seems, of the logic of, you know, not reproducing or recirculating images of like, you know, police brutality itself, which I think, you know, has the element of it that makes sense, but also, you know, interestingly also does not stop it from happening. And so there's kind of these weird, the way that these layers of, I guess, reality interact, like this sort of like, you know, actual event and this quote unquote, like, you know, an embodied reality, then like its representation, like in terms of photos and video, and then the re-representation of it in, you know, like paint or some digital rendering or whatever. So there's, and all this stuff is flying around at once, and it's becomes quite confusing. And I think like with things like Breonna Taylor being like, they had the painting on the cover of maybe Vanity Fair or something of her, and like again how there's a split between people who, or it seems like a split to me between people who are like, this is so silly, you know, this is like symbolic and ultimately opportunistic of a magazine like that. And then there are people who seem to really doggedly believe that that does like spread awareness about something and has some sort of, you know, like actual direct use value in terms of a like liberation project or something like that, which has just been really interesting and confusing to watch, like the, yeah, this kind of acceleration of these different things and the confusion.
There's some way to push a bit deeper on these questions, and I'm aware of the debate you're talking about. To go back to your remarks, and for me, what's interesting is the different ways in which thinking can be manifest. And one of the key terms I keep using, Sentient Flesh, is multiplicitousness. What interests me is the proliferation of possible forms of expression, not their reduction, not their elimination. And I have a certain ethical in the difference. Right? And for me, the ethics is the ethics of the increasing of possibility. Odd in of being able to always be on the move.
Yeah.
And in that regard, what interests me about, we're still talking about forms of representation of mimesis, is what interests me is the expressions of affect, of thinking, and I don't mean to make a distinction. I think that affect is an order of thinking as well. It's an order of intelligence. But the different ways in which those expressions are manifested, made available to us in different media, right? Which is why I'm interested in you know, works like, let's say, to go back to Perry, Typhoon, for instance. What's being expressed here? How is it being expressed, right? How does it call me? How do I respond? How do I share that? And that's a kind of conversation that's taking place, right? Just as we could go back to music when you know, a good band goes into a good groove and we're all dancing and responding to it, and that affects the play it as well. Those things interest me because those things say something about the possible ways that we in fact do and can think of ourselves together in the world. And I mean that in the most open. You can ground it in particulars if you want. The debates about the representational politics of art, which have been around Black art, and to me have been rather superficial. and beside the point in that.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I wonder.
Beside the point of expression, which clearly I think of myself as someone who's engaged in trying to give material expression to a particular way of thinking and being in the world. So I value all of that. So to reduce it to whether, and I know the argument, the crime of forever depicting Black suffering, right? Which is one of the aspects of scenes of subjection. That there's
right.
this sort of pornographic aspect of it, right? And that is supposedly wrong. Well, to the extent that it's used for a particular political purpose, yes, but there's got to be a distinction made between the artistic expression, to use lack of a better term, and that political use of it. Right? So if someone is meditating upon the profundity of Emmett Till's bloody murder, and the profundity of both a mother's having to come to terms with the fact, the event of her teenage boy's violent death, and as any mother would do, would be contemplating his last moments, how he felt them, that maternal empathy, right? And wanting to engage that profundity, that maternal profundity around this issue, as well as the courage involved in having an open casket to share, as Emmett Till did. All of that, where that sharing is meant to mark that we're in together, and how do we deal with it, right? If someone wants to try to depict that in the medium of expression they know, I'm all in favor of that.
Yeah, I think that with that, like, it's interesting because I think
I don't care what the artist looks like. I don't care what color the artist's hair is. I don't care the lines of the artist's face. What interests me is the form of expression, right? And when we want to make those facts of the artist of paramount importance, I wonder what we're talking about.
Well, it's interesting because I think
we're talking about something.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, yeah, with that, I think at a time I definitely was like, oh, I don't do it, had a very like prohibitive attitude towards that. I think now something that's interesting to me is that really with a work like that, let's say, like that, really what the issue around that is that, like, and this goes back to just like art world politics, that there should be more space, or there should be an actual ongoing collective practice of like critique in a real way, where there are tools to say like, oh, you know what, I don't think that worked. I don't think that, like, as a work, in terms of that being the goal for me, they didn't work. Here's why, in terms of the history, and actually writing critically toward, but rather than it being a sort of like, this shouldn't have happened at all, and this is like, purely like, yeah, ethic, like this person's ethics are now in question, when it's like, well, ultimately what you're saying is like, it didn't work for you, and you think that as an artistic gesture and as a political gesture, it falls short, and that's like a fine thing to like have a conversation about. But the sort of like, now, yeah. But I think that also, it's also difficult because I think we're in a moment, and I think it's very, it's really intense for Black artists and writers this moment, but also for everyone, that's sort of this, entanglement of artistic and political intention, where, like, I agree with you, like, if you want to use something for, artistic purposes, like, you should, but then now there's kind of this really aggressive conflation of artistic purposes and political purposes, I think, right now, which is like a kind of just maybe fact of the times. Maybe it has to do with like, people losing their heads with like the Trump administration, all that stuff. But I think it's an interesting thing. And then also you're with the affect, I think, yeah, the thing that frustrates me and I'm interested in is kind of, yeah, the sort of, I think this has to do with the internet as well, but like sort of limited set of affects that are deemed like appropriate in given arenas or something, or kind of like in terms of like Black art, there's a certain, like, it feels like there's a certain set of affects that one must transmit for it to like qualify in certain ways. Otherwise it's kind of begins to like bleed out of the space of quote unquote capital Black, capital A art. Then I also wondered what you think about, again, I guess this goes back to sort of like maybe sort of hierarchy of forms, but do you think that like certain, like music, for instance, seems like it's so much easier to have a sort of sense of affective primacy in terms of like producing and analyzing it as a you know, as like a creative object or something? Do you agree that, like, maybe to me music just seems like the gets to the heart of so much of this, and you can really, like, it doesn't have that much of it's not that much necessary translation, I guess, in order to get to the affective register in how you approach it? What I mean, I guess,
How
is
do you
like,
mean?
I mean that in terms of, like, let's say thinking about music versus thinking about film, I guess, again, since we were talking about film, like, affect seems like ready at hand kind of in thinking about music, like there's a sort of direct line to the realm of quote unquote feeling, I suppose. And then in film, maybe just also because of the trends of like historical analysis or something, like, you know, you get drawn into like the linguistic or the semiotic before you can really get to the affective in certain ways. Like, I don't know, just the way that people talk about film, or even with like painting, you know, I feel like people will go to, you know, specifically representational conversations rather than like being able to reach an affective layer immediately. Maybe that's like, I don't know,
That's a complicated and for me even vexing question. There's a couple of things that you said there that I think are important. Of course, part of the complication and vexation for me is there is a clear record of Black people engaging in all kinds of profoundly experimental musical forms. And I'm with Anthony Braxton, that experimentation is the very nature of Black expression in being. In the moment we stop being experimental, we stop being Black. That's an important music as a medium, sound, right, has been a medium in which Black people have excelled considerably for all kinds of interesting historical reasons. So the challenge becomes whether or not it's possible to do that same sort of experimentation where the intricate relationship between medium, the material of expression, technique, and for lack of a better word, concept of thinking and affect, whether or not it's possible to have that same kind of dynamic set of relationships, connections with another medium, say, and this is for me where I'm invested, writing. Right, as I said at the beginning of this reading and the reading this morning, this work was I worked very hard to try and be rhythmic in a very particular way, and in a way that involves bending a lot of rules of grammar. Oh, there are more typos in this that I would care than I'm pleased with, precisely because when you're trying to deliberately bend rules, you don't want to have others be mistakenly broken to get in the way. So how is it possible to achieve that same sort of verve in other? I think that that's part of what you're asking about. Writing it poses a very particular order of challenges and difficulties, whereas with film, let's say, as a medium, and as a medium that involves so many mediums at once, okay, in almost immediate juxtaposition. I think the only thing that gets translated per se is the storybook, right, which gets translated in action and conversation. But one can think of sculpture, one can think of painting. Right? And I would dare say in those forms, the same order of experimentation that's possible. This is a formal question. What you're talking about, I think, that's going on with the so-called Black art is a confluence of the politics of the moment, Trump, as you say, but also the trend that was going on in the art world in the beginning of the 1980s towards a certain kind of commercialization, and always the perpetual search for the next hot item of value. Metrics of value have very little to do with formal expression. And, you know, as we think about this, talking right now, the same thing happened to music in the last decade of the last century and the first decade of this century, with you know, Spotify and all of those forms of musical reproduction that have made real incursions into musicianship, music creativity, music reception. Right? Those are the forces I think we're contending with. And those are forces of market. Those are forces of capitalism. And even the political forces you're referring to, I think, are in some way responsive to that. I don't want to sound impatient. I'm trying to grapple with the politics that are involved in these debates, because I find that the politics themselves lose of the work.
Yeah, no, I agree.
But lose sight of the artist who's doing the work.
Yeah, yeah. I totally agree. I think it's very difficult to, it's like to talk about, because I mean, yeah, because of the times, you know, whatever, I think it's really difficult also to talk about, to critique the ways that people are engaging on, you know, the politics of making work, you know, in terms of, let's say, writing critically, whatever, to critique that without it then, you know, being like, you know, seeming, you know, because there is like supposedly a well-formulated position that's against that, you know, that sort of status quo, but it's like, well, no, I'm actually interested in like, how could we talk about this in a way that leaves more space for, you know, yeah, like the artist and for, you know, also just the, you know, all the work that has been done, whatever, you know, however, whatever we want to take from it in terms of like postmodernism, like even all that stuff kind of is lost in the mix in terms of like the space between the artist, the work, and the viewer. You know, everything's kind of like this like really interpretive locked down kind of register. But I don't know, I guess we've been talking for a while. Also, I don't know if there's supposed to be questions from the audience or how much, what time you were supposed to go, but I think it's been about
my time has long. I've missed an event I was supposed to be at, but that's of no
oh no,
moment.
okay.
So
Well, we can, I also have
that's not on you.
no, it's fine. I also have other stuff I have to do today, but I mean, it's really great. It's been really great to get to, you know, talk to you about this. I don't know, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to talk about?
Well, there's a lot I need to ask you, but again, we just marked that we've been at it for a long time, and what you just said, really prompts me to want to ask you some questions about your own thinking about this as an artist, right? Because you know, some of this is some old debate. This was going on in the late 1920s and 1930s around the aesthetic project of the Black arts movement. And part of what we're dealing with is the question of, as you said earlier, what is art? What is aesthetics? Right? And what is aesthetics in relationship to polity and relationship to sociality? And you know, that opens up to the question of understanding our history. That is to say, our history of modernity. You know, and understanding, you know, at what points and why and how the distinction's made. You know, when does aesthetics fall by the wayside in a particular way? There have been tons of works that have written upon this, but we still have not found some way to think about it in any kind of sustainable way.
Yeah.
Right. And there have been all kinds of, I mean, the German Romantics tried to evolve the notion of the aesthetic state, where the whole point was to make aesthetics really foundational to sociality and to polity. The need to make it so indicated it's having no longer been so. Whether you want to have the argument that the Enlightenment brought it about was a certain kind of ascendancy of rational reasoning, which I'm not absolutely certain of, having been a long student of Kant, although there is that tension there. So this is what we're asking. What is aesthetics? And we need to ask this now. And we need to ask this now in this period of hyper mechanical reproduction.
Yeah.
And fluidity, going back to the example of music, for example, where Most Def, when he was still Most Def, back in '95, I think it was, when this magazine was a new thing, did an interesting interview in it, where he was talking about what was a beginning trend in the music industry. And that was of alacrity, right? Where he's classically trained as a musician. He said that we've reached a point now with the commercialization of music that if you lay down a new phrase, gone are the days in which you could play with it and toy with it and experiment with it over time to master it.
Mm-hmm.
An example, Beethoven.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as it's laid out, it becomes copied. Right away commodified.
Yeah.
And everybody's doing it. And you're not permitted to elaborate it. You have to move on to the next one, or you're dead in the water. And he said, this trend is going to destroy musicianship.
Mm-hmm.
I tell that story in terms of what we're talking about, because that's, I think, an illustration. It's heuristic of the ways in which the aesthetic, however meaningless, gets lost.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The question of beauty.
Yeah.
Films are beautiful. First and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
Love is the message. Okay, fine. That's great, right? Everyone wants to focus on the thematic aspect. But the shots he takes, the lines he emphasizes, perform that beauty.
Yeah.
Right? I'm losing it. That wonderful film shot in Florida. Moonlight.
Oh, Moonlight. Yeah.
Pardon?
Moonlight?
Moonlight.
Yeah.
It is Moonlight. It's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a sustained study of the beauty of shade and tone and light and movement.
Mm-hmm.
It's beautiful, foremost. That's what it is, right? And it is a performance of a certain attitude towards beauty.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we find we can call it a black towards beauty. That's great. But beyond that label, its formal aspects are what make it beautiful. And I want to attend to that. As I was just saying about Idrisu Marokopai's film, it's really beautiful in what it achieves formally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the question, what is art, that you asked before, is a fundamental. What has happened to aesthetics?
Yeah. Yeah.
What has happened to, why can't we talk about beauty?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's also like right now, especially in contemporary art as well, it is this sort of yeah, I mean, I guess it's some well, one, I think there's sort of like, and I don't know exactly who I would credit with this being the fault of, but like that there's that sort of, well, beauty, like some sort of pitting of beauty and politics against one another, which obviously doesn't really hold as a, yeah, like it doesn't really make any sense. Then also kind of, so yeah, the triviality that sort of like a formally like beautiful object somehow, yeah, gets pinned with. But then also I think again, as I was saying before, like a sort of weird over historicization or like shutting down of like what a object by a Black artist that is beautiful, like what its priorities must be, kind of in some sort of like prescriptive way. And I think like again, I think with AJ's work, it's always really interesting to me because people are obsessed with talking about, yeah, the thematic register of Love is the Message. And like we did that when they did that screening of it where all those institutions screened it, I was like, really, I think I'd spoken about the work a few different times. So it kind of was like, this time I'm just going to be like the formalism like person. I'm just like going to be the person who's like, let's talk about the editing. Because if you just talk about like, oh, like there's sad images of Black people and happy ones, like we're not going to get anywhere with like what this work actually does in, in terms of how it lives alongside other works, etc. And I think there's always kind of this, and not just with his work, but I think, with Sandra Perry's work, with Martine's work, with my own work, I think it's always this immediate like running to the themes and politics door, rather than like approaching like what was this person doing in terms of like how they wanted to approach this and what it looks like, and it's a very, which then does make me feel like, I'm like, oh, I could put anything, I could put an empty black box in the gallery and it's going to have the same, it's not going to matter because there's not really, then I don't know, there's not that much of an engagement. But yeah, I don't know. I think also with the like massive circulation of images and video content, especially online, that also just shifts. Like I think what, sort of people's relationships to aesthetics and especially like the aesthetics of video now, like also with Love is the Message, like the fact that piece, looks like video content from YouTube and has that, kind of like pixely, you know, for a lot of the contents on there. It's like an interesting moment too for like, what are people used to seeing, what feels vernacular, what feels, again, like high art. But also to go back to the Alain Locke thing, I recently, I wasn't aware of this tidbit, but this, and I'm sure you probably are, but this conversation that he and Claude McKay had in Berlin in like 1923, yeah, which I just like stumbled across something about, and was really just interested in that as the fact that like the way they're talking about, yeah, what's the project, like, you know, for Black art, though that conversation is now like basically almost, yeah, 100 years ago, it feels like frighteningly like the questions are still in play, and like, and yeah, that sort of like, you know, Black arts movement, like New Negro sort of like, we must blah 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 blah. It's like super boring, but then also it's like still this thing that keeps coming up, and everyone's like, well, like, should we be making like monuments to, you know, even with the sort of monument question, you know, and taking down monuments that have these rights supremacist past, and then like, where was it they like put up a monument of like some young Black woman who had like been a protester in place of this like old racist guy, and it's just like, I don't know, this
London.
is like, yeah, in London, yes, and it's just like I don't know, these things are, you know, we've made progress in certain ways, but the idea of progress is kind of a bit out the window. It's kind of this cycling through these.
The McKay Locke was one of the ones I had in mind when I said this is an argument that was taking place in the 1920s and 1930s.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting and important exchange. Of course, McKay was very serious artist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he's the one with
Don't even get me started.
Whose poem "If I Must Die" was for a long time considered one of the founding anthem of Negro movement. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
And he was an amazing sonneteer and a very serious student of form, both in the novel as well as in poetry. Beginning writing vernacular poetry in Jamaica when Jekyll found him, the Fabian Jekyll found him. And in that argument between them, tension had to do with the deontologist, the philosopher Locke, right, who had a remarkably instrumentalist relationship and conceptualization of artistic expression.
Right.
Right. It was going to free the people in a certain way or change white people's minds. He's having an argument with an artist who's going about the call, the demand, the vocation of expression.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And that call and demand and vocation of expression, which seems to attend the species from its emergence, right? Whether it's setting a set of symmetrical or asymmetrical lines on a shell in order to try and materialize working of imagination. I mean, it's so fundamental to what we're doing and the role imagination plays in what we're doing. How do you realize imagination? How do you realize dreams, which is about realizing the capacity of the species to think and work and make the world and be in the world. That's what's always at stake. So here we have someone who's passionately, intimately involved in that vocation and that struggle and that contestation, wanting to talk about that as an aspect, right? And Kay's understanding that to the extent that Blackness was involved in all of that, which it is, it's involved in it in the that it brings to the fore a general human situation,
right?
And it's got to be a way of both attending to the particularities of that expression of imagination and other particular expressions of imagination. There's got to be a way of moving past the structures of oppression and talking about these issues, and moving beyond the questions of authenticity,
right,
and legitimacy and illegitimacy, to engage the expressions of imagination that are being offered up. And they're always historical. So, you know, moonlighting is about growing with a certain gender fluidity or sexual fluidity in Florida. in a very intense environment, in a very historically black town, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's about precisely that, growing up, what it is to see the world.
Yeah. Right.
Right. That you may be all of those things, and that are part of what you are, but they're just a part of what you are. There's also you looking out the window at the moon or sitting on the beach.
Right.
And being taken in by the infinity of the movement. And they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah. But yeah, and I think that that's something that I think for me in terms of like thinking about writing and making work, and also in reading this book, I think kind of, and this is like, it's like a very, very, it's an extreme reduction of obviously like a far more philosophical argument, but kind of like really like what a lot of this is about is like, how do you not either like find the middle ground between, or not quite synthesize, but work, hold together that, particularity and that universality. Like, yes, like there are things about being Black that are things that are about, existence, like Blackness, like fashions the understanding of the world in so many ways. Then also there are the particularities of like a Black experience, a Black politic, and also those are then geographically bounded, and it's, becomes like Russian dolls kind of. But then also like, but then we also, are all just looking at, everyone's looking at the same moon. And so it's kind of, I think I appreciated the way that you've kind of worked through some of those questions. And then it also reminded me of, I don't know if you have read or enjoy or interested in Francois Lavarelle's writing at all, but like his sort of idea of like the generic and the like that, I think for me is also like as I was reading, I was thinking about that as like another line of thinking that's trying to again sort of find a way between in the cracks between these different kind of registers. But yeah, there's a question from the chat we can also answer, and then maybe we should, I don't know, wrap up soon. But someone asked, what in your opinion gave music and other art of older ages a strong lasting aesthetic, strong enough to still be relevant to us as listeners today?
Everything we just said.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to flip it, everything we just said.
Yeah.
I don't want to suggest that music and art today don't have that aesthetic force. I think they do. Part of what we're talking about has to do with sociology. What I mean by this is our combined education in appreciating diverse forms of representation. So for example, with music, the predominance of the Dolby system it was a political decision that was made in the 1980s by the Reagan administration in defunding arts and school programs. The diminishing function of art education in elementary schools, music and otherwise, produces a population here mid-range.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not because the population is inherently weak or flawed, but it's because society's investment in a certain kind of education has shifted. And it's important to mark that it was a very specific political shift. I mean, I'm from Minneapolis, and in 1927, the superintendent, whose name escapes me, very deliberately instituted a very robust mandatory music education program in the public schools, which is a program that my parents benefited from, my parents benefited from, and I benefited from. Whereas little kids, we were given some instrument in 5th grade. You had no choice, it was mandatory, and you had to stick with it, right? And that continued up to your junior year of high school. And he had a very particular agenda, and that was, he had an investment in the importance of aesthetic education for producing a particular kind of citizenry, for producing a particular kind of sociology. And of course, the Minneapolis sound comes out of that, right? And there's a very rich milieu, and you can go, but there's a number of LPs released about the sound before, Prince blew up large in 1979, where you see it's part of a continuum, which is not to take away from his virtuosity, but you've got people like Daryl Bowe, the sounds of blackness. There's a great deal of virtuosity, but that came out of that education structure in which it was indeed a milieu where aesthetics of music was paramount. And we all talked about music, we played in varying degrees of proficiency, we played, etc., etc., etc. And that has a lot to do with what you're talking about, question in terms of this strong, lasting aesthetics, which is not to take away from the strength of the work itself, but that the work is embedded within a very specific social history and possibility.
I also think that now, I just in the work that I was doing at Rise, I think a lot of also, I guess we touched on the sort of like, with the most F thing, the speed with which things are like, you kind of can't, continue to work over or elaborate on a given form or something, but also the way that like, the attention economy and like, this sort of like overgrown like version of capitalism that we live with, like everything is marketized and all like human activity, people, the amount of people who on the internet are like, pay me for my art. And it's like, things that they're posting on, there's kind of this like intensive, just like everything's marketized. And so that idea of like expression, I feel like is really, people are, I think, even for myself, I feel like I've had to really like section off, my life such that it's like, this is, I'm work and this is my work. And that, the consuming I'm doing online is not, an active expression of my, interests or interiority or my like, I'm not thinking in action when I'm like tweeting in a real way. And I think that, but it becomes difficult where, people are just kind of like looped into this kind of ongoing like cycle of production that is not really necessarily a free space for creativity, though it appears to be one. But that's my anti-internet like thing.
No, I think that's the pertinent question that is put before us, right? About what gave music and art in older ages a stronger, lasting aesthetic, and they weren't that much older in my lifetime. And I think that has to do with the shift you're talking about, right? It's when I was a young man in the early 70s, hanging around with an artistic collective in Minneapolis. I was the tag on poet. Two of them become important artists, the Bacon and Situ Jones. They were driven by the need to give expression, but also to share that expression, right, with others, right, in a community that can understand. So there were all kinds of news, makeshift galleries, makeshift installations, finding space in recognized galleries and museum spots, and of course, Seitu went very much into public art, huge public things on the sides of buildings. And I remember one sculpture that he didn't, and I was drafted with the others to kind of help put it together, right? But this was about sharing, and the presumption that there were people who would be interested in this. The commodification that you're talking about is significantly a commodification that doesn't entail, and a commodification that in a very peculiar way has a false community that equates the expansiveness of data circulation with community.
Right.
So who are you making art for? You put it in terms of it's a what? You're making it to make money.
Right.
Right. Which in some sense has become a principal way. Although if you very specific places, Houston, there are pockets and boroughs in New York, here in Pittsburgh, in the north side, also around Homewood and what's left of East Liberty, you find these pockets of artists who are still wanting to create for community. And that's a way of putting it, right? They want to give expression in the ways that I've been talking about, but they want to give expressions they can share with people whom, people whom exist. I mean, that still takes place at a certain local level.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's absolutely the case that art has lost its aesthetic. And there are variations around the world. I mean, in Tunisia, where I spend a good deal of time, the aesthetics of poetry and music are still very powerful, as are the aesthetics of art and indeed film. Right? And it's just, that's still a situation where people will break out into popular songs at the drop of a hat. And you have the concept of the poet revolution, and there have been 3 of them since 2010. And bands associated with the social transformation. So you have a similar movement in places like Senegal around rap and hip hop. So there are pockets where this sort of lasting aesthetic, if you want, is the strong aesthetic is still there.
Yeah.
So it's more a question of not what is it about the art that gave it strong aesthetics, but what it is about us that we, in our attitude towards the aesthetic.
Yeah, like the context. Yeah.
That we have, as well as you're suggesting, Aria, we seem to have no time for the aesthetic.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good place to end.
No, something.
Sorry.
No.
No.
End on an upbeat. Say.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think like, okay, well, one thing that I've been thinking about has been, and this is like a total, like maybe it's a left turn, but just thinking about, I mean, yeah, this sort of, as you know, you're asking in the book, like this relationship between the me and the we. And I think that's what we're talking about too with this, you know, maybe art and, you know, a sort of strong aesthetic movement comes from the me being rooted in a very strong we, you know, or some sort of community that can, you know, either be produced with in, you know, in concert or, you know, can be an audience for your work. And I think I've been excited to see that. I think especially since the summer, and not simply among Black people, but I think younger people, people have sort of been retreating into smaller communities and primarily like often offline communities, or like, you know, like group chats and things like that. And I think there's kind of we maybe reached a peak of that sort of like overly extended idea of a quote unquote community. And maybe I think people are turning towards more communal ways of working and producing value on top of that, and actually thinking about like, how can we work in a way that, how can we be together in a way that benefits everyone as equally as possible, and taking our, you know, production and leisure time and et cetera out of these realms of like capital circulation and, you know, hollowed out community. So that's been exciting to see. And so I've been thinking a lot about.
That's a note to end on. That's a note to end on.
The silver lining. Yeah.
That's no, because that's the sort of thing that Sentient Flesh was written to speak to, right? Which is why its recurrent question is how we can be together in common. And the two art forms that I point to, the dance and the juba beating, are formally that, right? That even the soloist is an articulation of the collective work. So when you tell me that these things, you know, popping off, jumping off, you know, yes, I know some of them. I refer to them in places like New York and here. That's a good place. I mean, it's not over with.
Yeah. It's not over till it's over.
Because this is about imagination. The only way it's going to be over with is if we no longer exist as a species.
Yes. Which, you know, we got to work on that one. But well, thank you for your time. This is really exciting, and I hope this is not the last conversation that we have. I have so many questions for you, and so, but it was really a pleasure. And you know,
I hope that we can continue this conversation